April 15th, 1917. Vimy Ridge, France. The temperature was 4 degrees Celsius, and rain was falling when Lance Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow lay motionless in a shell crater, pretending to be dead. Pegahmagabow was 27 years old, an Ojibwe sniper from Parry Island, Ontario, serving with the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion, and he had been lying in no man's land for 38 hours without moving. German soldiers had passed within 2 meters of his position 3 times. Each time, Pegahmagabow controlled his breathing and remained perfectly still. The Germans saw what they expected to see, another dead Canadian among the hundreds of dead Canadians scattered across Vimy Ridge. They kept walking. Pegahmagabow had 3 more days to survive before he could attempt to crawl back to Canadian lines. Francis Pegahmagabow came from the Parry Island First Nation on Georgian Bay. His parents died when he was 3 years old. He was raised by his grandfather, Noah Nebemaniquod, who taught him traditional Ojibwe hunting and tracking skills. Pegahmagabow learned to move silently through forests, to read animal signs, to wait motionless for hours while hunting deer. By age 15, he could track wounded deer across kilometers of rough terrain and could approach within meters of game without being detected. These skills were developed for survival and feeding his community. He never imagined they would be used for war. When World War I began in August 1914, Pegahmagabow was 23 years old and working as a guide and hunter near Parry Sound. Indigenous Canadians were not required to enlist. They were not even considered full citizens under Canadian law in 1914. But Pegahmagabow volunteered anyway in August 1914. He joined the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion and shipped to England for training. The Canadian military didn't know what to do with Indigenous soldiers initially. Pegahmagabow was assigned to standard infantry training, drill, rifle practice, trench tactics. He was adequate at drill and excellent at rifle practice. His instructors noted that Pegahmagabow could shoot accurately at ranges that most soldiers couldn't even see targets. In February 1915, the 1st Battalion deployed to France. Pegahmagabow experienced his first combat at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. German forces used poison gas for the first time. Canadian forces held their positions despite being gassed and suffering massive casualties. Pegahmagabow survived the battle and was noted in battalion records as having remained calm under artillery fire and gas attack. What the records didn't note was that Pegahmagabow had killed 17 German soldiers during the battle using his rifle. He didn't report this number. He simply did his job. By late 1915, Pegahmagabow's battalion commander recognized that Pegahmagabow had unusual skills. He could move silently through trenches. He could identify German positions by observing small details, disturbed earth, reflection off metal, movement patterns. He could shoot accurately at extreme ranges. The commander assigned Pegahmagabow to sniper duties. Pegahmagabow was given a Ross rifle with telescopic sight and authorized to operate independently in no man's land. Sniping in World War I was different from later wars. There were no established sniper schools or standardized tactics. Snipers developed their own methods through trial and error. Pegahmagabow applied his hunting skills directly. He would study German trench lines for hours, identifying patterns in sentry rotations and weak points in defenses. He would crawl into no man's land at night, find a concealed position, and wait motionless for hours or days until a target appeared. Then he would take one shot and immediately relocate before German forces could identify his position. Between 1915 and 1917, Pegahmagabow killed 378 German soldiers. This number was documented by his battalion through confirmed kills. Instances where Canadian observers verified that Pegahmagabow's shot had killed a specific German soldier. The actual number was likely higher because many kills couldn't be confirmed. Pegahmagabow became the most effective sniper in Canadian military history and one of the most effective in the entire British Empire forces during World War I. But effectiveness came with cost. German forces hated snipers and made them priority targets. If a sniper was captured, execution was common. If a sniper position was identified, artillery bombardment would target that position intensely. Pegahmagabow understood these risks and managed them carefully. He never used the same position twice. He never took more than 2 shots from any location. He always established multiple escape routes before taking a shot. On April 9, 1917, the Battle of Vimy Ridge began. Canadian forces were tasked with capturing Vimy Ridge, a strategic position that French and British forces had failed to capture despite 2 years of attempts. The Canadian plan involved massive artillery preparation, followed by infantry assault. Pegahmagabow's role was to advance ahead of infantry and eliminate German machine gun positions that would threaten the assault. At 0530 hours on April 9th, Pegahmagabow crawled into no man's land, while Canadian artillery bombarded German positions. The bombardment was so intense that the ground shook continuously. Pegahmagabow used the artillery noise to cover his movement. He crawled 200 meters across broken ground, avoiding shell craters and barbed wire, until he reached a position 50 meters from German frontline trenches. He found a shell crater partially filled with mud and positioned himself inside it with his rifle aimed at a German machine gun position. At 0540 hours, the Canadian artillery shifted to a rolling barrage, moving deeper into German positions. Canadian infantry began their assault. German machine guns opened fire. Pegahmagabow could see 3 German machine gun teams in their positions. He shot the first machine gunner at 0542 hours. The German fell. Another German soldier moved to operate the machine gun. Pegahmagabow shot him at 0543 hours. The machine gun went silent. Pegahmagabow shifted his aim to the second machine gun position. He shot that gunner at 0544 hours. The gun went silent. He was shifting to the third position when German artillery began counter-bombardment. A shell exploded 15 meters from Pegahmagabow's crater. Shrapnel hit his left shoulder and side. Pegahmagabow was knocked backward into the mud. He felt immediate pain and wetness, blood soaking his uniform. He checked his wounds. Shrapnel had penetrated his shoulder and side, but hadn't hit major arteries. He was bleeding, but not critically. He could still move. The Canadian infantry assault was continuing around him, soldiers advancing past his position toward German trenches. Pegahmagabow tried to stand and follow them, but his legs wouldn't support his weight. He had lost too much blood. He collapsed back into the crater. German artillery continued bombarding the area. Shells exploded continuously. Pegahmagabow understood his situation. He was wounded and unable to walk. Canadian infantry had advanced past his position. German forces would counterattack and likely retake this ground. If German soldiers found him alive and identified him as a sniper, they would execute him. His only option was to hide and hope Canadian forces maintained control of this area long enough for him to be rescued. Pegahmagabow had one advantage. He was Ojibwe and had been trained since childhood to survive in hostile environments. He assessed his resources. He had his rifle with approximately 40 rounds remaining. He had a canteen with water. He had no food. He had a small medical kit with bandages. He was lying in a shell crater in no man's land with German and Canadian forces fighting around him. He made a decision. He would hide in the crater and pretend to be dead until either Canadian forces secured the area or he recovered enough strength to crawl back to Canadian lines. He used his bandages to bind his wounds and slow the bleeding. Then he covered himself partially with mud and positioned himself to appear like just another casualty. He placed his rifle underneath his body where it wouldn't be visible. Then he lay completely still. German artillery bombardment continued for 3 hours. Shells exploded around Pegahmagabow's crater, but none hit directly. At 0900 hours, the bombardment stopped. Pegahmagabow could hear German voices, soldiers counterattacking, trying to retake positions captured by Canadian forces. He heard boots approaching his crater. He controlled his breathing and remained motionless. 3 German soldiers approached. They were searching the area, checking bodies for intelligence documents and weapons. One soldier stopped at Pegahmagabow's crater and looked down. Pegahmagabow kept his eyes partially open. Closed eyes looked suspicious on a fresh corpse. He stared without focusing, letting his eyes appear glazed. The German soldier stared at him for several seconds. Then the soldier moved on. Pegahmagabow had passed his first test. Over the next 12 hours, German and Canadian forces fought for control of the area around Pegahmagabow's crater. The front line shifted back and forth. At times, German forces controlled the ground around him. At times, Canadian forces controlled it. Pegahmagabow remained motionless through all of this. He didn't move when shells exploded nearby. He didn't move when soldiers walked past. He didn't move when rats crawled on him, investigating whether he was actually dead. By nightfall on April 9th, Canadian forces had secured most of Vimy Ridge, but the area around Pegahmagabow's crater remained contested. Pegahmagabow was thirsty, but couldn't risk drinking from his canteen while soldiers might be watching. He was in pain from his wounds, but couldn't risk moving to adjust his position. He simply lay still and endured. April 10th brought rain, cold rain that filled the crater partially with water. Pegahmagabow lay in cold water mixed with blood and mud, unable to move without risking discovery. German patrols passed his position twice during the day. Each time, Pegahmagabow held his breath and remained perfectly still. Each time, the Germans saw a dead Canadian in a crater and kept moving. By April 11th, Pegahmagabow had been lying in the crater for 50 hours. His wounds had stopped bleeding, but were beginning to show signs of infection. He was extremely thirsty. He was cold. He was starting to experience hallucinations from dehydration and blood loss. But he remained disciplined. He knew that moving before the area was secure would mean death. On the night of April 11th, Pegahmagabow heard Canadian voices. A patrol was searching the area, checking for wounded. Pegahmagabow waited until he was certain they were Canadian. He verified their accents and vocabulary. Then he moved slightly and groaned. The movement sent pain through his body, but it worked. A Canadian soldier noticed the movement and called out, "Wounded here!" 2 soldiers approached the crater carefully, unsure if Pegahmagabow was actually Canadian or if this was a German trap. Pegahmagabow spoke in English. "Lance Corporal Pegahmagabow, 1st Battalion. Been here since the 9th. The soldiers were shocked. "You've been lying here for 2.5 days." "Yes." They helped him out of the crater. Pegahmagabow tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. The soldiers carried him back to Canadian lines on a stretcher. At the battalion aid station, the medical officer examined his wounds. The shrapnel wounds were infected, but not critically. The officer asked how Pegahmagabow survived 2.5 days in no man's land without being discovered or killed. Pegahmagabow said, "I learned to wait when I was young. Hunting deer, you wait until the right moment. Same principle." The medical officer didn't fully understand, but noted in his report, Lance Corporal Pegahmagabow recovered from no man's land after 60 hours. Wounds infected, but survivable. Remarkable endurance and discipline. Pegahmagabow was evacuated to a field hospital for treatment. His wounds required 3 weeks to heal. During this time, he learned that the Battle of Vimy Ridge had been a complete Canadian victory. All objectives captured. German forces pushed back. Vimy Ridge was now under Canadian control. Pegahmagabow had contributed to this victory by eliminating 3 machine gun positions in the critical early minutes of the assault. His battalion commander recommended him for a medal. Pegahmagabow received the military medal for his actions at Vimy Ridge. The citation mentioned conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty, but didn't mention the 60 hours spent pretending to be dead in no man's land. Military citations rarely captured the full reality of what soldiers endured. By June 1917, Pegahmagabow had recovered and returned to his battalion. He resumed sniper duties. Between June 1917 and November 1918, he killed an additional 280 German soldiers, bringing his total to 378 confirmed kills. He also captured 300 German soldiers, instances where he approached German positions so stealthily that he could capture soldiers before they realized he was there. But the 60 hours at Vimy Ridge had changed something in Pegahmagabow. He had learned that he could survive situations that would kill most men. He had learned that the hunting skills his grandfather taught him were more effective in war than any military training. And he had learned that pretending to be dead was sometimes the best survival tactic available. This knowledge would be tested again. October 30th, 1917, Passchendaele, Belgium. 6 months after Vimy Ridge, Pegahmagabow found himself in an even worse situation. The Battle of Passchendaele had turned the Belgian landscape into a swamp. Constant rain and artillery bombardment had destroyed all drainage systems. The ground was liquid mud in many places, deep enough to drown men who fell into shell craters. Pegahmagabow was advancing with his battalion toward German positions when German machine gun fire erupted from a concrete pillbox 80 meters ahead. Pegahmagabow dropped into a shell crater for cover. The crater was filled with waist-deep water. 3 other Canadian soldiers were already in the crater, also taking cover. The machine gun fire was so intense that anyone who tried to leave the crater was cut down immediately. They were pinned. Pegahmagabow assessed the situation. The pillbox was too well positioned to assault directly. Artillery support wasn't available. Canadian artillery was focused on other objectives. They needed to eliminate that machine gun, or the entire battalion advance would stall. Pegahmagabow told the other 3 soldiers, "Stay here. Keep the machine gun's attention. I'll approach from the flank." One soldier said, "You can't cross that ground. They'll kill you." "They'll kill you if you're moving," Pegahmagabow said. "They won't see you if you're not." Pegahmagabow waited until the machine gun shifted its fire to target other Canadian soldiers approaching from a different angle. Then he climbed out of the crater and lay flat in the mud. He didn't crawl, he slivered, moving so slowly and staying so flat that he was indistinguishable from the churned mud and debris covering the battlefield. He moved 5 meters in 10 minutes. Then he stopped and waited motionless for another 10 minutes, watching the machine gun's field of fire. The German gunners were focused on obvious threats: soldiers moving quickly, soldiers in groups, soldiers firing back. They didn't notice a single shape lying perfectly still in the mud 75 meters away. Pegahmagabow moved another 5 meters, stopped, waited, moved again. Over the course of 2 hours, he covered 60 meters, bringing him within 20 meters of the pillbox. From this position, Pegahmagabow could see the machine gun firing port. He could see the German gunner's silhouette. He slowly, carefully positioned his rifle. He aimed. He waited for the gunner to pause reloading. The gunner paused. Pegahmagabow fired. The gunner fell. The machine gun went silent. German soldiers inside the pillbox scrambled to replace the dead gunner. Pegahmagabow shot the replacement. Then he shot a 3rd German who tried to operate the gun. The Germans inside the pillbox realized they were being targeted by a sniper, but couldn't identify his position. Pegahmagabow was covered in mud, lying flat in terrain that looked like churned earth and debris. He was invisible. The Germans did what Pegahmagabow expected. They threw grenades in the general direction they thought the sniper might be. The grenades exploded around Pegahmagabow's position. One exploded 5 meters away, showering him with mud and shrapnel. He was hit again, shrapnel in his leg and back. Pain exploded through his body, but he didn't move. Moving would reveal his position and bring more grenades. Pegahmagabow lay motionless as blood soaked into the mud beneath him. He could hear German voices from the pillbox arguing about where the sniper was. He could hear Canadian forces advancing now that the machine gun was silent. He wanted to signal to Canadian forces that he was wounded and needed help, but signaling would reveal his position to Germans who might still throw grenades. He made a decision. He would stay motionless until Canadian forces captured the pillbox. Then he would identify himself. He lay in the mud, wounded, bleeding, while battle raged around him. Canadian forces assaulted the pillbox from multiple directions. German forces inside surrendered after 10 minutes of fighting. Canadian soldiers secured the pillbox and began searching the area. Pegahmagabow waited until he saw Canadian soldiers approaching his position. Then he moved his hand slightly and called out weakly, "Canadian wounded here." Soldiers rushed to him. They were shocked to find a Canadian soldier lying 20 meters from a German pillbox, covered in mud, barely visible. They carefully lifted him and saw the blood. "Medic!" one soldier shouted. A medic examined Pegahmagabow's wounds, shrapnel in leg and back, similar to Vimy Ridge but in different locations. The medic asked how long Pegahmagabow had been lying there. Pegahmagabow said 2.5 hours since being wounded. The medic said most men would have screamed or tried to crawl away when hit by shrapnel. Pegahmagabow said screaming or moving would have brought more grenades. They evacuated Pegahmagabow to a field hospital. Again, his wounds required weeks to heal. Again, his battalion commander recommended him for a medal. This time, Pegahmagabow received a bar to his military medal, a second award. The citation mentioned exceptional skill as a scout and sniper, but again didn't fully describe what had happened. Pegahmagabow returned to duty in January 1918. He continued sniping operations through the final year of the war. His methods never changed. Patient observation, silent movement, 1 or 2 shots maximum, immediate relocation. These methods kept him alive when many other snipers were killed. By November 1918, when the war ended, Pegahmagabow had survived 4 years of combat, been wounded multiple times, and killed 378 German soldiers. The statistics were extraordinary, but what made Pegahmagabow remarkable wasn't just the numbers, it was the method. He had taken traditional Ojibwe hunting skills developed over generations for survival and food gathering, and applied them to warfare with devastating effectiveness. The Canadian military never fully understood this. They saw Pegahmagabow as an exceptionally skilled sniper, but didn't understand that his effectiveness came from a completely different knowledge system than European military training provided. After the war ended, Pegahmagabow returned to Canada in 1919. He was 29 years old and had served longer in frontline combat than most soldiers survived. He returned to Parry Island and tried to resume normal life. This proved difficult. The Canadian government's treatment of Indigenous veterans was shameful. Despite having served with distinction, Indigenous veterans were denied many benefits available to non-Indigenous veterans. Pegahmagabow had been one of Canada's most effective soldiers, but was not considered a full citizen under Canadian law. Pegahmagabow spent the next 30 years fighting for Indigenous rights. He became chief of the Parry Island Band and later supreme chief of the Native Independent Government. He advocated for treaty rights, land rights, and proper recognition of Indigenous veterans. This work was frustrating and often unsuccessful. The Canadian government was resistant to Indigenous self-determination, but Pegahmagabow continued fighting because he understood persistence. He had learned it hunting deer as a boy and had applied it to war. The same patience he used lying motionless in shell craters for days, he applied to political advocacy. In 1949, the Canadian government finally granted Indigenous people the right to vote in federal elections, 34 years after World War I ended. Pegahmagabow was 59 years old. He had been fighting for Indigenous rights longer than he had fought in the war. He told a journalist that getting the vote took more persistence than any military operation he had conducted. In war, You can see the enemy. In politics, the enemy is invisible systems and attitudes. That's harder to fight. During these decades, Pegahmagabow rarely spoke about his war service. When asked, he would acknowledge that he served as a sniper, but provided no details about the 378 confirmed kills or the multiple instances of lying wounded in no man's land pretending to be dead. He didn't see his military service as the most important thing he had done. He saw his post-war advocacy work as more significant because it potentially benefited entire communities rather than individual soldiers. Pegahmagabow died on August 5, 1952, at age 61 from heart failure. His obituary in the Parry Sound newspaper mentioned his military service and his work as chief of Parry Island Band, but didn't mention that he was the most effective sniper in Canadian military history. This information wasn't widely known at the time. The Canadian military had records of Pegahmagabow's confirmed kills, but these records weren't publicized. Pegahmagabow was buried at Parry Island with traditional Ojibwe ceremonies. For decades after his death, Pegahmagabow remained largely unknown, except to military historians who studied sniper effectiveness. But in the 1980s and 1990s, there was renewed interest in Indigenous contributions to Canadian military history. Researchers discovered Pegahmagabow's military records and were shocked by what they found. The German perspective. In 1987, a German military historian named Klaus Schreiber was researching German casualty records from World War I. Schreiber had access to German military archives that documented losses by unit, date, and, when possible, cause of death. Schreiber noticed an unusual pattern in casualty records from sectors where Canadian forces operated between 1915 to 1918. Specifically, there were sectors where German casualties from sniper fire were significantly higher than average. Schreiber cross-referenced these sectors with Canadian military records and discovered that the highest German sniper casualties occurred in sectors where the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion operated. Further investigation revealed references to a single Canadian sniper who was particularly effective. German intelligence reports from 1917 mentioned ein kanadischer Scharfschütze von außergewöhnlicher Fähigkeit, a Canadian sniper of exceptional ability. The reports noted that this sniper could remain undetected for extended periods and could shoot accurately at ranges exceeding typical sniper engagements. Schreiber wanted to identify this Canadian sniper. He contacted Canadian military archives and was directed to Pegahmagabow's service records. Schreiber was stunned by what he found. 378 confirmed kills, multiple instances of solo operations deep in German-held territory, capture of 300 German soldiers. These numbers exceeded any other sniper in Canadian or British Empire forces during World War I. Schreiber wrote to Pegahmagabow's surviving family in 1988, asking if any family members would be willing to discuss Pegahmagabow's military service from a historical perspective. Pegahmagabow's grandson, William Pegahmagabow Jr., responded. William Jr. was 42 years old and had grown up hearing occasional stories about his grandfather, but had never fully understood the scope of his grandfather's military effectiveness. Schreiber traveled to Parry Island in 1989 to meet William Jr. Schreiber brought copies of German casualty records and intelligence reports from World War I. He showed William Jr. the German intelligence reports mentioning the exceptional Canadian sniper who operated in their sectors. He showed casualty statistics demonstrating that German losses to sniper fire increased dramatically when Pegahmagabow was operating in a sector. Your grandfather was responsible for approximately 400 German deaths during the war, Schreiber said. That's not counting the 300 he captured. From the German perspective, he was one of the most dangerous individuals we faced. William Jr. asked how German forces tried to counter Pegahmagabow. Schreiber explained that German forces never successfully identified or countered him because they couldn't find him. Traditional counter-sniper tactics involve identifying the sniper's position and either eliminating him with artillery or sending your own snipers to kill him. Your grandfather never stayed in one position long enough to be identified. German reports describe him as ghost-like. He would appear, take shots, and disappear before we could respond. William Jr. said his grandfather rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, he mentioned learning to be still. He said the most important skill was knowing when not to move. He learned this hunting deer as a boy. The deer would be close, but if you moved too soon, the deer would run. You waited until exactly the right moment. He said war was the same. Wait until the right moment, then act decisively. Schreiber asked if Pegahmagabow had ever expressed regret about killing so many German soldiers. William Jr. thought carefully. My grandfather didn't talk about killing Germans as accomplishment or as regret. He talked about it as survival. He was in a situation where killing enemy soldiers was necessary to survive and to protect Canadian soldiers around him. He did what was necessary. After the war, he focused on other things: advocacy for Indigenous rights, supporting his community. The war was something that happened. It didn't define him. Schreiber mentioned the instances where Pegahmagabow lay wounded in no man's land, pretending to be dead. German reports mention finding dead Canadian soldiers who later turned out to be alive. We never understood how some soldiers could survive days in no man's land without moving. Your grandfather did this multiple times. How? William Jr. explained what his grandfather had told him. Ojibwe hunters learned to be still, completely still, breathing controlled, no fidgeting, no movement even when uncomfortable or in pain. This skill takes years to develop. My grandfather learned it as a child and practiced it his entire life. For him, lying motionless for days was difficult, but not impossible. It was an extension of skills he already had. From the German perspective, Schreiber said, your grandfather was fighting a different kind of war than we were trained for. European military tactics in 1914 to 1918 were based on formations, artillery, machine guns, trenches. Your grandfather was fighting individually, using skills from a completely different tradition. We had no effective counter to that. Schreiber and William Jr. corresponded for several years. Schreiber provided German military documents related to sectors where Pegahmagabow operated. William Jr. provided family stories and context about Ojibwe traditions that informed his grandfather's approach to warfare. In 1995, Schreiber published a book titled Indigenous Warriors: Native American Contributions to Allied Victory in World War I. The book included a chapter about Pegahmagabow, describing him as possibly the most effective individual combat soldier on the Western Front. The book's publication led to increased recognition of Pegahmagabow's military service. In 2003, Canada Post issued a commemorative stamp featuring Pegahmagabow. In 2016, the Canadian government posthumously designated Pegahmagabow a Person of National Historic Significance. A memorial was erected at Parry Island, honoring his military service and his advocacy work. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from William Jr.'s efforts to document his grandfather's full story. William Jr. spent years interviewing elders from Parry Island who had known Pegahmagabow, collecting oral histories and combining these with military records to create a complete picture of his grandfather's life. What emerged was a complex portrait. A man who was extraordinarily effective at warfare, but didn't define himself by warfare. A man who killed 378 enemy soldiers, but spent more time and energy advocating peacefully for Indigenous rights. A man who could lie motionless in freezing mud for days, but chose to spend most of his life working patiently through political systems to achieve change. The lesson. The lesson from Francis Pegahmagabow's story is not primarily about sniping or military tactics. It is about the value of knowledge systems that exist outside mainstream military traditions. European military forces in World War I had developed elaborate doctrines for infantry warfare, artillery, logistics, command structures. These doctrines were based on centuries of European military experience. They were sophisticated and effective within their framework. But Pegahmagabow operated outside this framework. His effectiveness came from skills developed over generations of Ojibwe hunting and survival traditions. These skills, silent movement, patient observation, stillness under stress, reading terrain, understanding wind and weather, were developed for entirely different purposes than warfare. But when applied to warfare, they proved devastatingly effective. The Canadian military benefited from Pegahmagabow's skills, but never fully understood them. They saw him as an exceptional individual, rather than as someone drawing on a deep knowledge tradition. After the war, when Pegahmagabow advocated for Indigenous rights and recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems, the Canadian government was resistant. They had been willing to use Indigenous skills in warfare, but were not willing to respect Indigenous knowledge in peacetime. Pegahmagabow understood this irony. He had saved countless Canadian lives through his sniping effectiveness. He had been wounded multiple times fighting for Canada, yet after the war, he was denied full citizenship rights and had to fight for decades to achieve basic recognition of Indigenous treaty rights. He told a journalist in 1948, "In war, Canada wanted my skills. In peace, Canada wants to forget I exist." This tells you what Canada values. This bitterness was justified, but Pegahmagabow didn't let it stop him from continuing his advocacy work. The same persistence that kept him alive, lying wounded in shell craters, the same patience he learned hunting deer as a boy, he applied to political advocacy. Progress was slow, but Pegahmagabow maintained pressure consistently for 30 years, until finally achieving some recognition of Indigenous voting rights before he died. The connection between his childhood hunting skills and his war effectiveness and his post-war advocacy is not coincidental. All three drew on the same fundamental approach: careful observation, patient waiting, acting at the right moment, persistence despite hardship. These were Ojibwe values and skills passed down through generations. Pegahmagabow applied them to different contexts: hunting, warfare, politics, but the underlying approach remained consistent. When Schreiber asked William Jr. what his grandfather would want people to know about his war service, William Jr. said, he would want people to know that Indigenous knowledge systems are valuable, not just for warfare, for everything. The same skills that made him an effective warrior made him an effective advocate and an effective community leader. These skills came from Ojibwe traditions that Canada spent most of its history trying to destroy through residential schools and assimilation policies. My grandfather proved those traditions had value. He survived situations that killed most soldiers because of knowledge his grandfather taught him. That's what he would want remembered. Not the 378 kills, but the knowledge tradition that made those kills possible, and that also made his advocacy work possible. Francis Pegahmagabow lay motionless in shell craters for days, wounded and surrounded by enemies, because his grandfather had taught him how to wait while hunting deer. He killed 378 enemy soldiers because his grandfather had taught him how to move silently and shoot accurately. He advocated successfully for Indigenous rights because his grandfather had taught him patience and persistence. All of this came from the same source: Ojibwe knowledge passed across generations. The Canadian military used this knowledge when convenient, but didn't respect its origins. Pegahmagabow spent his life demonstrating that Indigenous knowledge systems deserved respect, not just for military purposes, but as complete, sophisticated approaches to life that had value in all contexts. Sometimes the most effective approach to a problem comes from outside the established systems. Sometimes the skills developed for one purpose prove unexpectedly valuable in completely different contexts. Sometimes the knowledge that mainstream society dismisses or tries to destroy turns out to be more effective than the mainstream knowledge itself. Pegahmagabow understood all of this. He lived it, and he tried to teach it through both his military service and his post-war advocacy. Whether people learned the lesson is a different question, but the lesson was there, demonstrated through 378 confirmed kills and 30 years of patient advocacy and a lifetime of applying Ojibwe wisdom to whatever challenges he faced.